Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our channel. I'm absolutely thrilled to have you here today because we're about to dive into one of the most brilliant detective novels ever written. Today, we're exploring Agatha Christie's masterpiece, The Body in the Library, and trust me, you're in for quite a ride. Now, I know many of you are fans of mystery and crime fiction, and if you are, you've probably heard of the legendary Agatha Christie. This woman was an absolute genius when it came to crafting intricate plots, creating unforgettable characters, and keeping readers on the edge of their seats until the very last page. She gave us iconic detectives like Hercule Poirot and Miss Jane Marple, and wrote over 60 detective novels, each one more captivating than the last. But today, we're focusing on a particularly special novel, The Body in the Library, published in 1942, featuring the delightful Miss Marple. Now, Miss Marple might seem like just a sweet, elderly lady who enjoys gardening and knitting, but don't let that fool you. She has an extraordinary ability to solve the most complex crimes using nothing but her keen observation skills and deep understanding of human nature. This novel isn't just your typical murder mystery. Oh no, it's so much more complex than that. We're dealing with two murders, an elaborate deception, identity swapping, and a cast of characters where everyone has secrets and motives. I'm going to take you on a comprehensive 90-minute journey through every twist and turn of this incredible story, from the moment that shocking discovery is made in Colonel Bantry's library, all the way to the stunning revelation that no one saw coming. What makes this story particularly fascinating is how Christie manages to weave together multiple storylines, red herrings, and character motivations into one cohesive, mind-bending plot. The way she manipulates our expectations and leads us down false paths while hiding the truth in plain sight is nothing short of masterful. So settle in, get comfortable, and prepare yourself for a story that will challenge everything you think you know about murder mysteries. We're about to enter the world of St. Mary Mead, where nothing is quite what it seems, and where a seemingly impossible crime will test the limits of even Miss Marple's extraordinary detective abilities. Let's begin our journey into one of Agatha Christie's most ingenious puzzles. Picture this scene with me. We're in England, in the charming village of St. Mary Mead, a place where life typically moves at a gentle, predictable pace. The kind of village where everyone knows everyone, where the most exciting event is usually the annual flower show, and where violent crime is virtually unheard of. In this peaceful setting stands Gossington Hall, an impressive manor house that serves as home to Colonel Arthur Bantry and his wife Dolly. Colonel Bantry is exactly what you'd expect from a retired military officer in 1940s England. He's a respected gentleman, the local magistrate, a man of routine and order who takes great pride in his well-maintained estate. His wife, Mrs. Dolly Bantry, is a warm, intelligent woman who's well-liked throughout the village and happens to be a dear friend of our detective, Miss Jane Marple. On this particular morning, at precisely 7 o'clock, Mrs. Bantry was awakened not by her usual alarm, but by the frantic voice of their housemaid, Mary. The poor girl was practically hysterical, stammering something that seemed absolutely impossible. Ma'am, there's a body in the library." Now, imagine Mrs. Bantry's reaction. Your first thought would probably be that the maid was having some sort of breakdown, or perhaps had experienced a particularly vivid nightmare. After all, bodies simply don't appear in the libraries of respectable country houses. But one look at Mary's terrified face, her trembling hands, and the genuine shock in her eyes told Mrs. Bantry that this was no mistake or delusion. Quickly throwing on her dressing gown, Mrs. Bantry hurried downstairs with her husband, their hearts pounding with a mixture of disbelief and growing dread. What they discovered in their library would shatter the peaceful tranquility of their lives forever. There, sprawled on the Persian rug in front of the fireplace, was indeed a body. But this wasn't just any body. It was a young woman, probably in her early 20s, with platinum blonde hair styled in fashionable waves. She was wearing a stunning evening gown of electric blue satin that shimmered even in the morning light, and her face was heavily made up with rouge, lipstick, and eye makeup that seemed almost theatrical in its application. The contrast was jarring and deeply unsettling. Here was this glamorous, almost Hollywood-style figure lying dead in the most traditional conservative English library you could imagine. The room itself was the epitome of respectability. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes, comfortable leather armchairs, a massive oak desk, and family portraits gazing down from the walls. Everything was in its proper place, neat and orderly, except for this one shocking, inexplicable intrusion. Colonel Bantry, despite his military background and experience with difficult situations, found himself completely at a loss. He stood there, staring at the scene, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Who was this woman? How had she gotten into their locked house? And most importantly, who had killed her? Because it was immediately clear that this was no natural death. The marks around her neck indicated strangulation. Mrs. Bantry, showing the practical wisdom that would serve her well throughout this ordeal, immediately took charge of the situation. Her first call was to the police, of course, but her second thought was of her dear friend, Miss Marple. If anyone could make sense of this impossible situation, it would be Jane. Miss Jane Marple lived just a short walk away in the village. To most people, she appeared to be nothing more than a sweet, elderly spinster who spent her time tending her garden, observing the village life from her window, and engaging in what many considered harmless gossip. But Mrs. Bantry knew better. She had witnessed Miss Marple's extraordinary ability to see through deception and uncover truth where others saw only confusion. While they waited for the police to arrive, the Bantrys found themselves studying the scene more carefully, though they were careful not to disturb anything. The young woman's evening gown was expensive and well made, suggesting she moved in affluent circles. Her jewelry, while not excessive, was clearly of good quality. Her nails were painted a bright red, though Mrs. Bantry noticed that the polish seemed hastily applied, with small imperfections that suggested either nervousness or haste. The library itself showed no signs of struggle. Nothing was overturned, no books were scattered, no furniture was displaced. It was as if the woman had simply been placed there, like a piece of furniture that didn't belong. This observation would prove to be more significant than anyone realized at the time. When the police arrived, led by Inspector Slack and later joined by Chief Constable Colonel Melchett, they began their methodical examination of the scene. The questions were obvious, but seemed to have no ready answers. Who was this woman? When had she died? How had she entered the house? And most puzzling of all, why had someone chosen to place her body in the Bantry's library? The house had been securely locked the night before, with all windows fastened and doors bolted. The Bantrys had retired at their usual time and had heard nothing unusual during the night. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no jimmied locks. It was as if the woman had simply materialized in their library. When Miss Marple arrived, summoned by her friend's urgent telephone call, she brought with her an entirely different perspective. While others saw only the shocking incongruity of the scene, Miss Marple began to notice details that would prove crucial to solving the mystery. She observed the heavy makeup, the theatrical quality of the woman's appearance, and the way the evening gown seemed almost like a costume rather than clothing chosen for a normal social occasion. This young woman, Miss Marple murmured to herself, was not dressed for a quiet evening at home. She was dressed to be seen, to perform, to entertain. But where and for whom? And so began one of Miss Marple's most challenging cases, a puzzle that would test even her remarkable abilities and lead her into a world of deception, greed, and cold-blooded murder that was far more complex than anyone could have imagined. The investigation began in earnest as soon as the police established their procedures and began canvassing the local area. It didn't take long for them to discover the identity of the mysterious young woman, and when they did, the case took on an entirely new dimension that would lead them far from the quiet village of St. Mary Mead. The victim was identified as Ruby Keene, a professional dancer employed at the Majestic Hotel in the seaside resort town of Danemouth, approximately 20 miles away. Ruby was 23 years old, vivacious and attractive, with dreams of stardom that had brought her from a modest background to the glittering world of hotel entertainment. She was the kind of young woman who lit up a room when she entered, full of life and ambition, making her tragic end all the more poignant. The identification came through her cousin, Josephine Turner, who also worked as a dancer at the Majestic Hotel. When Josephine was brought in to view the body, her reaction was immediate and dramatic. She broke down in tears, confirming what the police had suspected. This was indeed Ruby Keene, who had been reported missing since the previous evening. "She didn't come back to our room last night," Josephine sobbed. "We were supposed to meet after the evening show, but she never appeared. I thought maybe she'd gone out with friends, but when morning came and she still wasn't back, I knew something terrible had happened." But this identification, while solving one mystery, opened up a dozen new questions. What was Ruby Keene doing in Colonel Bantry's library? She had no connection to the Bantry family, had never been to St. Mary Mead, and had no apparent reason to be anywhere near Gossington Hall. The geographical distance between Danemouth and St. Mary Mead made the situation even more puzzling. How had she traveled that distance? Who had brought her, and why? The police began their investigation by examining the grounds around Gossington Hall more thoroughly. They discovered that one of the ground floor windows had been left unlatched, providing a possible point of entry. However, this window was in the morning room, quite some distance from the library, which raised the question of how the body had been transported through the house without leaving any trace or disturbing anything else. Suspicion quickly fell on a young man named Basil Blake, who lived in a small cottage on the Bantry estate. Basil was in his late 20s, worked for Lenville Studios as a film production assistant, and had a reputation in the village as something of a wild character. He drove a flashy car, kept irregular hours, and was known to host parties that the more conservative villagers found scandalous. When the police arrived at Basil's cottage to question him, they found him in a state that only increased their suspicions. He was nervous, evasive, and clearly hadn't slept. His clothes from the previous evening were disheveled, and he seemed to be hiding something. Under pressure from Inspector Slack's questioning, Basil's story began to emerge, and it was stranger than anyone could have anticipated. According to Basil, he had spent the previous evening in London with his girlfriend, Dinah Lee. They had attended a party and several nightclubs, and Basil had returned to his cottage in the early hours of the morning, somewhat the worse for drink. When he entered his sitting room, he was horrified to discover the body of a young woman lying on his floor. "I thought I was seeing things at first," Basil explained, his voice shaking. "I mean, you come home after a night out, and there's a dead body in your living room. Your first thought is that you're hallucinating, or that someone's playing a sick joke. But she was definitely dead, and she was definitely real." Basil's next decision was what made his story so difficult to believe. Instead of immediately calling the police, as any reasonable person would do, he had panicked. He was convinced that he was being framed for murder, that someone had deliberately placed the body in his cottage to implicate him in the crime. Given his reputation in the village and his unconventional lifestyle, he was certain that he would be the prime suspect. "I knew how it would look," he said desperately. "Young woman found dead in the home of the village's resident bohemian. I could already see the headlines. I'd be convicted before I even got to trial." So Basil had made what he later admitted was a terrible decision. He had loaded the body into his car and driven to Gossington Hall, reasoning that if the body were found there, the police would take the investigation more seriously and wouldn't automatically assume he was the killer. He had entered through the unlocked window and placed the body in the library, then returned home. It was a bizarre story, but Basil was able to provide corroboration for most of it. Dinah Lee confirmed that they had been together in London until the early hours. The taxi driver who had brought Basil home remembered the fare and the time. Several witnesses at the London venues could place Basil there during the crucial evening hours. The police were faced with a dilemma. While Basil was clearly guilty of interfering with evidence and moving a body, it seemed increasingly unlikely that he was the actual murderer. The timeline didn't work, and his alibi was solid. But if Basil wasn't the killer, then who was? And why had someone chosen to place the body in his cottage in the first place? Miss Marple, who had been following the investigation with keen interest, offered her own perspective on the situation. "I think," she said thoughtfully, "that whoever killed this poor girl intended for Mr. Blake to be blamed for the crime. They chose his cottage specifically because they knew his reputation would make him a natural suspect. What they didn't anticipate was that he would move the body." This insight opened up an entirely new line of investigation. If the real killer had intended to frame Basil Blake, then they must have known about his lifestyle and reputation. they must have had access to his cottage, and they must have had a strong motive for wanting Ruby Keene dead. The investigation now turned to Ruby's life at the Majestic Hotel, and it was here that the case began to reveal its true complexity. Ruby, it emerged, was not just an ordinary hotel dancer. She had formed a close relationship with one of the hotel's most distinguished guests, a wealthy elderly gentleman named Conway Jefferson. Conway Jefferson was a tragic figure in his own right. He had lost his wife, son, and daughter in a plane crash several years earlier, an accident that had also left him permanently disabled and confined to a wheelchair. The loss had devastated him, leaving him a broken man with little interest in life. Living with him at the hotel were his daughter-in-law Adelaide Jefferson, widow of his deceased son, and his son-in-law Mark Gaskell, widower of his deceased daughter. Ruby Keene had somehow managed to break through Conway's grief and depression. Her youth, vitality, and genuine affection had given him a reason to live again. She would sit with him for hours, listening to his stories, playing cards, and bringing laughter back into his life. To Conway, Ruby represented hope and renewal, a chance to recapture some of the joy he had lost. The relationship had progressed to the point where Conway Jefferson had made a shocking decision. He intended to legally adopt Ruby Keene, making her his heir and ensuring that she would inherit a substantial portion of his considerable fortune. And here, finally, was a motive for murder that made sense. Conway Jefferson was an extremely wealthy man, and his current heirs, Adelaide Jefferson and Mark Gaskell, stood to lose a significant inheritance if Ruby became part of the family. Both were facing financial difficulties, and both had opposed the adoption plan. The case was beginning to take shape, but Miss Marple sensed that there were still pieces missing from the puzzle. The solution, when it came, would prove to be far more complex and diabolical than anyone had imagined. Before we dive deeper into this fascinating mystery, I want to take just a moment to connect with all of you amazing viewers. If you're enjoying this detailed exploration of Agatha Christie's brilliant plotting, please don't forget to give this video a thumbs up. It really helps the channel reach more mystery lovers like yourselves, and it lets me know that you're enjoying this type of in-depth literary analysis. And if you haven't already subscribed to the channel, I'd love to have you join our community of book enthusiasts. We explore classic literature, mystery novels, and fascinating stories from authors around the world. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest content. I'm also really curious about your thoughts so far. Did you suspect that Basil Blake wasn't the real killer? What do you think about the motive involving Conway Jefferson's inheritance? And here's a challenge for you detective fiction fans. Can you guess who the real killer might be before we reveal the solution? Drop your theories in the comments below. I love reading your insights and seeing how you piece together the clues. Now, let's get back to our story and discover the shocking truth about the Jefferson family, their financial troubles, and the deadly lengths someone was willing to go to protect their inheritance. To truly understand the motives behind Ruby Keene's murder, we need to delve deep into the complex dynamics of the Jefferson family and the tragic circumstances that had shaped their lives. This is where Agatha Christie's genius for character development really shines, as she creates a web of relationships, dependencies, and hidden resentments that provide the perfect breeding ground for murder. Conway Jefferson had once been a man who seemed to have everything. Wealthy, successful, and surrounded by a loving family, he had built a business empire and enjoyed all the privileges that money could buy. But fate had dealt him a devastating blow when a plane crash claimed the lives of his wife, his son Frank, and his daughter Rosamond, while leaving him permanently disabled. In one terrible moment, he had lost not just his family, but his mobility and his will to live. The crash had occurred several years before our story begins, and in the intervening time, Conway had become a shadow of his former self. He was confined to a wheelchair, dependent on others for his daily care, and consumed by grief and loneliness. His vast fortune, which had once brought him joy because he could share it with those he loved, now seemed meaningless. What was the point of wealth when there was no one left to enjoy it with? Living with Conway at the Majestic Hotel were the two people who represented his only remaining family connections. Adelaide Jefferson was the widow of his son Frank, a woman in her 40s who had taken on the role of Conway's caregiver and companion. She was elegant, well-educated, and had always maintained a dignified presence, But the years of caring for a grieving, disabled man had taken their toll on her. She had her own son from a previous marriage, Peter, who was away at school, and she had sacrificed her own chances for happiness to care for Conway. Mark Gaskell was the widower of Conway's daughter Rosamond, a charming and handsome man in his 30s who had once been a successful businessman in his own right. However, Mark had made a series of poor investment decisions and had lost most of his personal fortune. He was now heavily in debt and struggling to maintain the lifestyle he had once enjoyed. Like Adelaide, he had remained close to Conway, partly out of genuine affection, but also because he was financially dependent on the older man's generosity. Both Adelaide and Mark had naturally assumed that they would be Conway's primary heirs. After all, they were his closest living relatives. They had stood by him through his darkest period, and they had sacrificed their own lives to care for him. The expectation of inheriting Conway's fortune was not just a hope for them, it was a necessity. Adelaide needed financial security for herself and her son, while Mark desperately needed money to pay off his debts and rebuild his life. Then Ruby Keene entered the picture, and everything changed. Ruby was everything that Conway's life had been lacking: young, vibrant, full of laughter and energy. She had no knowledge of his tragic past, no preconceptions about who he should be or how he should behave. To her, he wasn't a broken, grieving man. He was simply a kind gentleman who enjoyed her company. She would sit with him for hours, not out of duty or obligation, but because she genuinely liked him. She would tell him about her dreams of becoming a famous dancer, her hopes for the future, and her excitement about life in general. For Conway, Ruby's presence was like a miracle. For the first time since the crash, he found himself looking forward to each day. He began to take an interest in his appearance again, started making plans for the future, and even began to laugh. Ruby had given him something that all the money in the world couldn't buy: a reason to live. The relationship between Conway and Ruby was entirely innocent, but it was also profound. She became the daughter he had lost, the bright spot in his darkness, the hope for his future. And as his affection for her grew, Conway began to consider a step that would shock everyone around him. He decided to legally adopt Ruby Keene. The adoption would make Ruby a Jefferson in the eyes of the law, entitled to a full share of Conway's inheritance. Given the size of his fortune, this meant that Ruby would receive millions of pounds, money that Adelaide and Mark had been counting on for their own futures. When Conway announced his intention to adopt Ruby, the reaction from Adelaide and Mark was swift and negative, though they tried to hide their true feelings. Publicly, they expressed concern about Conway's emotional state, suggesting that he was being taken advantage of by a young woman who was only interested in his money. They questioned Ruby's motives, her background, and her suitability to become part of their family. Adelaide, in particular, was devastated by the news. She had devoted years of her life to caring for Conway, had put her own needs aside, and had assumed that her loyalty would be rewarded. The thought of sharing Conway's inheritance with a young dancer who had known him for only a few months was almost unbearable. She tried to maintain her dignity and composure, but those close to her could see the strain she was under. Mark's reaction was more openly hostile, though he tried to disguise it as concern for Conway's welfare. Mark was facing financial ruin, with creditors demanding payment and his debts mounting daily. He had been counting on Conway's inheritance to solve all his problems, and the prospect of losing half or more of that inheritance to Ruby was catastrophic. He began to look for ways to discredit Ruby, to prove that she was unworthy of Conway's affection and trust. But Conway was determined to proceed with the adoption. He had found happiness again, and he wasn't going to let anyone take it away from him. He instructed his lawyers to begin the legal proceedings, and he made it clear that anyone who opposed his decision would find themselves cut out of his will entirely. It was at this point that Mark Gaskell began to consider more drastic measures. He was a man facing financial ruin, social disgrace, and the loss of everything he had hoped for. He was also a man with a secret that made him even more desperate. He was having an affair with Josephine Turner, Ruby's cousin and fellow dancer at the hotel. Josephine was a complex character in her own right. She was jealous of Ruby's success, both professionally and personally. Ruby was more popular with the hotel guests, more talented as a dancer, and now she had captured the affection of a wealthy man who was willing to make her his heir. Josephine felt overshadowed and resentful, and when Mark began to pay attention to her, she was flattered and eager to help him in any way she could. Mark and Josephine began to plot together, united by their shared resentment of Ruby and their desperate need for money. But their plan would be far more complex and diabolical than a simple murder. They were going to commit not one crime, but two, and they were going to use an elaborate deception to ensure that they would never be suspected. Their plan required a second victim, someone who resembled Ruby in build and general appearance. And unfortunately for her, they found the perfect candidate in an innocent young girl named Pamela Reeves.